Okay, we might make a start. So it's really good to see everybody here, and thanks for joining us. This morning we're going to hear from Meriel McClatchie from the School of Archaeology and Sónia Negrão from the School of Biology and Environmental Sciences about the DIVERSICROP project, which is funded under the Strategic Priority Research Framework Mechanism. So I look forward to hearing what they have to say.
Great, thank you, Taz, and thank you to the Earth Institute for inviting us to speak today. So we're going to speak about the DIVERSICROP research project, and both Sónia and I are very interested in plant foods and plant food production systems. Sónia in a modern context and me in much more of an ancient context. And the Earth Institute has given us, Sónia and I, a great opportunity to meet, first of all, to learn about each other's work. They've given us a space to collaborate and develop the project that I'm going to speak about today. So Sónia and I are interested in food security, past and present, and there's an increasing global interest in understanding how we manage future food security, particularly in the context of changing climatic conditions that are so apparent across the world. So the maps you're looking at now, you can see the northward shift of the agroclimatic zones across Europe. This is showing them analysed over the past 40 years. So say, for example, if you look at France, and if you look at southwest France in the maritime south, if you look at the map on the left from 75 to 95 climatic zones, you can see it's just down in the south and southwest. If you look, go forward to 1996 to 2016, you can see that upward shift. And it's very likely this will change further over the coming decades as well. And this will affect what foods we can produce, how we can produce the foods, and ultimately it will impact our food security as well. So climate change is not the only concern relating to food security. Most of our energy intake in our human diet depends on a really small number of plant species, maybe only about 20 plant species. Ones we know very well, things like wheat and maize and rice being particularly important in this. And with an increasing global population, we need to sustainably produce nutritious food within the context of these changing agroclimatic conditions. So in DIVERSICROP, what we're doing in this project, and we're very lucky to be funded by the Earth Institute Strategic Priority Scheme from 2019, we're trying to highlight the key role that underutilized crops can play in addressing some of these issues. So these are underutilized crops that are produced in Europe that can supply key nutrients and that can improve the diets and the risks of diet-related diseases also. So we are developing the DIVERSICROP network of partners, and Sónia is going to speak more about that in a couple of minutes. And through this network of research partners, we're trying to investigate target crops. So we've chosen a small number of target crops that are underutilized, and we want to investigate all of this under the framework of a Europe-funded cost action. So that's what we're doing at the moment, is preparing an application for that. So there are lots of different crops, excuse me, that we could have examined. There are many that you might call underutilized crops across Europe, but we think the project will be most effective if we target a small number of crops for thorough investigation. And we want to it's kind of like a bottom-up approach to some extent. We want to think about what are the factors involved to make these crops underutilized, and what are the steps, how did we get to the situation that we're in now with these crops being underutilized, and what steps might be needed to increase their uptake, and that's both for producers and also for consumers. So we've chosen 3 case study crops that you can see here: chickpeas, peas and rye, and these are stress resilient crops. They're nutrient dense crops. They've long been grown in different parts of Europe. They have a history going back thousands of years across Europe. But they're not widespread nowadays for lots of different reasons. And this is due to, there's a variety of issues. One of them that's interesting is social avoidance. So sometimes in regional food cultures, they're not seen as important, even if they were grown and consumed in those areas hundreds and thousands of years ago. Modern food cultures, they're just not seen as part of people's identity. Also, there can be perceived low yields from some of these crops, and also sometimes a lack of government policies to encourage cultivation. So government policies can have a really important role in incentivizing farmers to grow certain crops, and also disincentivizing farmers to grow them. So these are the 3 crops that we're going to look at: the chickpeas, peas and rye. You can see they've different features, higher protein with some resilient, peas being really important for nitrogen fixing, and rye, as you can see, multi-use is a good one with it as well. What we're looking at them not just in terms of ingredients, and we are looking at that aspect, but also in terms of food and food products. You can have the same ingredients, but you can use them to make a really healthy food or a not terribly healthy food as well. So we're looking at all aspects of the foods within this. So I'll hand over to my colleague Sónia now, who will introduce you to the framework of the project and how we're structuring it and the progress we've made over the past few months.
Thank you, Meriel. So what we decided was we started, as Meriel said, and we, with the help of the Earth Institute, we gathered a team of UCD colleagues. So we decided to work off 4 pillars. So the first one would be the crop science pillar. So the crop science, we started by having discussions within ourselves, and then we also hosted webinars with European partners. I'll show you in a minute. So we hosted a webinar with European partners, and within the crop science webinar, we brainstormed about what we could do in this cost action, what would be feasible. And we decided that one of the things that would be important would be to understand and map the regional environmental constraints. So for instance, of course, chickpeas are not cultivated in Norway, for instance, but they might be cultivated in the future, okay? Or on the other hand, there could be underutilized source of germplasm, so underutilized other accessions, varieties, genotypes of chickpeas that could actually be feasible to cultivate in other countries. So the idea within the crop science webinar would be to map the current challenges and environmental constraints, but also examine environmental adaptation of different sources of germplasm. Next, please. We also have on the nutrition side, the webinar discussion on the nutrition side with European partners. What we thought that would be interesting would be to detail current regional trends in food consumption. So for instance, if we think about rye, you have a very typical use of rye in bread in Western Europe. So if you go to Poland and Czech Republic, it's very common to have rye bread and very dark bread. However, if you go to southern countries like Italy, it's not common at all. However, and if we examine the yield potential of rye, it actually has a very high yield potential in Italy, but it's not cultivated, right? So when rye can be used, as Meriel was saying, in different sources of food. So this would be the task for nutrition. So they would look at the ingredients and then the different types of foods and at the European context. So trying to see different countries, how are they using these crops in different foods and how are they contributing to the diet. Next, please. So on the other side, we also have a big challenge ahead of us, which is to detail the policies. So why some governments incentivized the use of certain crops. For instance, I can give you the example of Portugal, where the dictatorship was incentivized, very incentivized, the cultivation of wheat from the 30s. And that basically destroyed the typical agriculture in some areas of the country and provide a big reliance on wheat. And whereas before it was cultivated maize and rye, and that was typically the ingredients for bread in some regions. So this would, it's understanding why governments incentivize some policies on certain crops or which led to the underutilization of these crops. Next, please. And then, of course, the ancient histories part, which is trying to understand the deep history of production and consumption of the three selected crops. So, for instance, again, as I said, rye was very, very used, but then different policies and different social constraints came, and social avoidance, etc. There were several factors that needs to be mapped and described to understand how those patterns shifted in Europe throughout time. And next slide, please. So this is the international network of partners. So we still have a little bit of work to go. So as you can see, there are some regions in the map that has been populated with the different pillars that we discussed within our webinars. So the cost action will revolve around these 4 pillars of nutrition, ancient history, crop science, and socioeconomic policies. So this is as we are all the partners that have accepted the challenge and have met with us on the webinars. And next slide, please. So this is the UCD DIVERSICROP team. So we are all plugged into the Earth Institute, and we have to really acknowledge the funding that we receive from the strategic call. On the nutrition side, we have Eileen Gibney leading the webinars on the nutrition part and leading that part. That will probably change in the cost action so that it's not all managed by UCD team members, and it will be led by different partners across Europe. On the ancient history, Meriel is leading that part. On the policy and socioeconomic, Parahita and Patrick Paul Walsh. And then from the crop science, Fiona, Bruce, and myself. And next, please. And so I would just like to finish with the challenge that has been to establish DIVERSICROP. As you can see, it can become very big and it can explode, let us put it that way, in many different ways. So that's a big challenge that we are facing, and all the discussions that we have been having within UCD, all the meetings within the UCD partners, but also in the webinars as well. So first is defining the rationale, and one of the most asked questions is like, DIVERSICROP, but then you're focusing on 3 crops, which is very important, right? But we could go that far, but then we could also lose the focus of the project. So this is a hard balance that we are facing. And then, of course, because we have to ensure that we are having smart objectives. And for that, we have, as Meriel said, what's wrong with the current crops? There's nothing wrong with wheat or potato, but we need to diversify the food intake in the future and also for cultivation. And what we are doing is a bottom-up approach where we are trying to understand where are these choices coming from in historical relevance, political relevance, led by consumer, led by farmers, led by policymakers. Why are we in this current situation, so that then we can explore how can we articulate to go to the next stage on promoting the diversification of crops in the future. And with that, I thank you all and open the door for discussion with these challenges that we are facing. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Sonia and Meriel. That was a really, really nice presentation and a lovely piece of work. I think it's great. It's really nice to see Earth Institute resources being spent so well on such good stuff. So, so thanks for that. Does anybody have any questions? I have a few, but I'll pass it out to the floor first.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Sonia, Meriel, thank you for your presentation. It was super nice. I don't know if you know, I know work soil and soil ecology. So I was thinking about soil as you were speaking. When you don't grow a crop for a long time in a place, you decouple basically the biology of that crop from all the microbiome and the soil you have in it. So I was just wondering how you're factoring in the soil dimension of this.
Well, we actually are not factoring that much at the moment. So that's as you said, it's like that was one of our problems, is defining the very smart objectives. So on the crop science, what we thought was focusing more on, because it's a cost action, and cost actions are fermented for networking and promoting and establishing the networks. And then the next stage comes next, which is applying for a project that could actually bring in the funding to do more concise research. So we have that within the cost action, which is tasks that are feasible and achievable to do without having big investments. So the easy one is mapping. And within that, we have partners on the crop science part that have some connections, and they can bring in probably some of those concerns as well. And how can we look at that? But we can also chat about it. I think really it would be helpful.
Thanks.
Great, thanks. So I know there's another question now from Kevin McDonald.
Great, thanks, Taz. Sonia and Meriel, thank you for that presentation. It was really interesting to hear it. If I may, 2 quick questions, please. I'm sure they're points you've considered. When you're introducing a crop like that, which might not be currently in production here in Ireland, do you see any issues from the regulatory side with, for example, Department of Agriculture? That's one part. And the second thing is, what do you see as your route to market to engaging with the consumers on a new product or a new crop if you're bringing it to the marketplace?
So that's exactly one of the challenges. Thank you, Kevin, for that question. And that's why we brought in the policy as experts on it. So the ideas that we try from the consumer perspective seems to have more impact on the government policies than the other way around, right? So and it's easier in a way to poke the consumer. So what we see now is a big shift actually in terms of consumer choices from the last years compared to 30 years ago. We have a more, as you know, we have a more plant-based diet. You go to the supermarket, you have vegan sections, you have all of those things that didn't exist at all just a couple of years ago. So there is a change. And I think that the way that's, and I can ask Appa if she wants to jump in and discuss Appa. So from the policy side, how would the policy would approach this? Appa?
Yep. Yeah. So yeah, so from the policy side, what we are planning is that like we will be looking into the economic policy and like at what point the government of different country and under what conditions the different countries chose not to pursue certain crops. And then on the social side, we will see like, you know, how society grows to accept some society, and culturally we grow to accept some crops and not accept other crops. So we are kind of now looking for partners, because this is not kind of my area. Food is not my area, but like I'm also learning in this process. So we will be looking and exploring the whole policy and how it interacts with societal and economic policies. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
So basically, we are just trying to establish the route so that in the future we know how to understand the choices, and then how can we lobby the other choices as well.
Okay, Sonia, thank you.
On a related note, actually, I was kind of wondering about the role of kind of the agricultural advisors through agencies, I guess, like Chagas. Is that also an avenue that you would look to specifically? In a way, it's as well as the kind of policymakers and the consumers, it's also obviously the farmers that need to be persuaded that this is a good way to go. And is that a potential route to the farmer?
Yeah, in terms of Ireland, within Ireland, so we have UCD, but we also have a partner at Chagas, Susan Barth. So she attended the webinar as well, and she has been involved as well. So the idea is that at the moment, and it's again, the challenges are that because the project is so nice and can go into so many different directions, that we are trying to keep ourselves focused on establishing the networks for the cost action and trying to map the concerns and then create the databases. So once we have the databases for nutrition, the databases for the environmental constraints, the databases for the policies as well, then it will be easier to understand where we are and why we are there. And that will can pave the way to other types of projects that can be Irish projects, and we are willing to discuss all of that with whoever is interested. so that because that's the whole point of this cost action, is just a beginning to then apply for further funding from the Department of Agriculture, for Horizon Europe, all the other types of funding that we can then source it out.
And as well as the local regulatory systems and the national ones, the European ones are hugely important. So as I'm learning, by talking to my colleagues in policy, pillar of this project is that there's so much that happens at that European regulatory level. So it's trying to tease apart what's happening locally, what's super local, what's regional, and what's actually at a European level, and to try and understand how we can change policy and how we can change behavior and what needs to happen.
Fantastic. Yeah, no, it's really interesting that you've got such a multi-pronged kind of perspective on it.
Very challenging.
Yeah. Well, actually, one of the other ones that kind of caught my interest, I guess, was the nutritional side, and as you sort of say, the rise of veganism and indeed the drift towards more plant protein for a lot of people who are not going vegan. That presents a really big opportunity, I guess. And you mentioned that 2 of your crops are high protein. Do you know at this point how they rank in relation to some of the more conventional crops that are already being grown? Is there going to be a good argument there to say, look, you know, if you switch towards these, you'll have a really good market in that domain?
I think there will be, but again, what we have been learning in all of these discussions, and at the first discussions just at UCD, was that sometimes things go beyond what we thought. So, for instance, I was thinking on society and cultural use, right? For instance, if we think about peas, they are used here, yes, but what Eileen was saying is that sometimes industry also plays a big role. So you have an industry implementing canned, coming out a new factory of canned peas. And suddenly that region over there starts producing peas, because then they have a market to sell on.
Mm-hmm.
So sometimes it's just like it goes beyond just a farmer or the policy. It also comes other factors come into play, which was very interesting, and I never thought of that. But that was the example that Eileen gave, was that you had she discussed at the time there was a UK area that was not cultivating peas or anything like that, and because that factory was established there, suddenly lots of farmers shifted their crops that they were producing just because they had a new market to explore.
Yeah, fascinating.
And then also learning from Eileen, it's not just about the ingredients, it's about what you do with them. So even if you think of wheat or something like that, you could go off after this and you could have a piece of wholemeal bread with your wheat, or you could have a big fancy pastry. And it depends on what you're doing with it and how nutritious that is. And that's something that I've learned a lot from Eileen's group about the importance of nutrient-dense foods. And that this seems to be important. It's not just what it contains itself, but it's what you're going to do with it as well. So again, so many aspects of it to think about, but that's what makes it fun as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
And that's why we had to take this bottom-top approach, because one of the discussions with everybody was like, why do these 3 crops? Why? And we started this exercise when we just, and we wanted, we thought about legumes, but there are several different legumes. But we wanted to, and we specifically selected chickpeas and peas just because they have a very ancient history in Europe. They have been cultivated for thousands of years. There is an habit of people eating them. Where if we go to other pulses, for instance, lentils, they are a more recent coming into Europe, so they are not that much in well established. Let's put it that way in the diets. So it's trying to play with all of these factors, which is quite fun. It has been a tremendously fun project to discuss with all the UCD partners, and then with colleagues as well at the webinar. But that's always the question: why not beans? Why not going to this? Why not? We can go all different ways.
Absolutely.
But then for the nutrition point, Eileen was very specific that it has to go this bottom-up approach. Otherwise, it will be very hard for them to map the food and the contribution to diet
Yeah.
And it stops being feasible as well.
I think it makes a lot of sense to narrow it down, and it's still diverse, and it's still about diversifying the crop base that's being grown, isn't it? You know, and it's a kind of a pilot in a way of investigating each of those crops, which could then be applied to others. So I think that's another useful way to think about it. Yeah, establishing a process. And any other questions from anybody else? I don't want to be hogging the questions.
Taz, is Kevin here. Just a quick follow-up actually on something that you have been discussing there. And it's a comment Sonia made about the peas from Eileen, that, you know, the industry can drive sometimes the development in a particular area. Have you considered, do we have the processing capabilities to deal with these new types of crops? Because I know, for example, CTech, who are pushing rye and rye development, have been very hesitant to encourage growers to grow without end-use contracts specifically for rye. So they're saying it's a great crop, absolutely, but if you don't have your contracts in place, we're not helping you with that part of it. And I think that could be a stumbling block to help growers get into new markets. So I'm just wondering, have you had any thoughts or consideration about what maybe processing capacity we might need, particularly for the protein crop space?
I think it's an excellent question, Kevin. And this goes again to mapping. That's why the commonality that we found in all of these webinars is the mapping, is creating the databases. So the first part of the project is to establish the network and creating the databases, so that then we can understand what needs to be done, which other types of reach outs can we do. For instance, I know that the whiskey industry is also starting to come up a lot with the interest on rye, just because they are producing to US. And US consumers like to have the whiskey also with rye.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there are lots of, and I think it's a long road ahead of us. And I think that we have to just keep on discussing. And the whole point of this, Kevin, is to start building up the network, and building up the network even in Ireland, so we can think about a more national approach. In the beginning, what Meriel and I and with the others discussed was a European approach, because then it will be easier to discuss, to understand why some areas are producing rye and have all the yield potential and others are not. Could be because of that, could be that you don't have an end selling point, you don't have a market. Could be because of policies, because you have a huge subsidized policy to cultivate something else. So it's mapping those challenges. And once we map those challenges, then we can actually pinpoint where we need to act and go to the next stage, which will be applying for national funding, other type of funding, so that we can then do research. Yeah, but I totally agree with you. It's an excellent question, Kevin. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate the response.
Thanks. We're out of time, so if there are no further questions, then I think that was a nice note to leave it on, as that it's a jumping off point for a further expansion into new ideas, and it's a long road ahead, which I think is absolutely right. And where those are the most interesting challenges, I think, where there's a lot to do. And a lot of different ways you could go about it, but it's clearly very exciting and very topical, and I really wish you all the best with it. So
thank you, and thank you, Earth Institute. And we didn't. I'm thinking, did I said Jenny Divine name? So she's the one that's really helping us on putting the project together. So we already had a meeting with Katrina and Jenny with Enterprise Ireland. So that we have all the support for the cost action, and Jenny is being tremendous, just keeping us on just making sure that we are on track. And it's just like it's just fantastic to have this help, to get the ball rolling.
Great, thanks very much. So
thank you.
See you next week. All the best.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Bye.